They said I should have cried. 300 wolves stood in that torchlit hall, shoulder to shoulder in the cold, their breath fogging in thin white clouds, their amber eyes burning through the dark. My mother's dress was on my body. The stone was under my bare feet. The man I had been told was my destiny stood 5 feet away and looked at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of his boot. They said I should have crumbled. I laughed instead. Not the nervous, broken kind of sound a woman makes when she is trying to hold herself together. Not the hysterical rattle of someone coming apart at the seams. A real laugh, clear and bright and completely unafraid, rising up from somewhere deep in my chest that I did not know existed until that exact moment, ringing through the great hall of Blackridge Mountain like a bell struck at midnight. The silence after it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My name is Vessa Thorn. I am 18 years old. And the night Corin Ashvale rejected me in front of everyone I had ever known was the night I finally understood what my mother had been preparing me for my entire life. She just never got the chance to tell me. 3 hours before the ceremony, I was kneeling on the cold stone floor of the lower corridor, tearing a strip from the hem of my dress. The dress was cotton. Simple white cotton with silver thread at the hem that my mother had sewn by hand, stitch by careful stitch, in the weeks before she got sick. She had pressed it into my hands 3 days before she died, when I was 15 years old, and had no idea that I would be wearing it to a ceremony like this one. It was the only thing of hers I had left. The fabric was soft from years of careful folding, and the silver thread caught the torchlight in a way that made it look like it was alive. I tore a strip from the bottom without hesitating. The girl on the floor in front of me was 7 years old. Her name was Pip, and she was one of the Pax Omega children, small and dark-haired, and usually so careful to be invisible that most people walked past her without noticing she existed. She had tripped on the uneven stone of the staircase that led down to the great hall, and her knee was bleeding in that free and generous way that children's knees bleed, soaking through her thin work dress in a dark red bloom. She was trying very hard not to cry. I knew that particular kind of trying. I had done it for years. "Hold still," I said softly, and I pressed the strip of cotton against her knee and held it there, watching her small face go through the complicated journey from pain to surprise to the shaky, cautious relief of someone who was not used to being helped. "Your dress," she whispered, staring at the torn hem. "It's just a dress. But the ceremony will happen whether the hem is intact or not." I tied the strip securely, not too tight, and sat back on my heels to look at her. Up close, she had the kind of dark, serious eyes that see more than they let on. Old eyes in a young face. I recognized those too. "Can you walk?" She tested her weight and nodded. "Good girl." I stood and smoothed what remained of my skirt. The tear was noticeable if you were looking for it. I decided I did not care. "Go find somewhere to sit that isn't the main floor tonight. The ceremony is for adults, and it's going to be crowded and loud." Pip looked at me for a moment with those ancient small eyes, like she was memorizing my face for a reason she couldn't explain yet. Then she nodded once, seriously, and slipped away into the shadows of the corridor. I did not know then that she would be the first one to speak in the open hall sessions weeks later. I did not know that the sound of her voice, small and shaking, describing 2 years of kitchen work without a single day of rest, would be the moment that cracked everything open. I just knew that her knee had been bleeding and I had something to wrap it with. I straightened my torn dress and walked down toward the great hall. Behind me, from somewhere in the upper corridor where she thought she could not be overheard, a voice said, "Look at her. She actually thinks tonight is going to go well for her." Delara Croft. I would have known that voice in complete darkness at 100 paces. Low and sweet and always carrying something serrated underneath. I did not turn around. I did not slow my steps. I had been hearing that voice my entire life. My father's name was Eden Thorne. He was a border guard. Not a high rank, not a celebrated position, not the kind of posting that earned a wolf a place at the upper tables or got his daughter invited to the highborn women's gatherings in the east wing of the mountain. He patrolled the southern edge of Black Ridge territory for 20 years, in all weather, in all seasons, with the quiet and thorough dedication of a man who understood that the unglamorous work was still necessary work. He died on the southern border when I was 12. The official record said it was a routine skirmish with a rogue pack that had crossed into Black Ridge land. It said he had been caught in the wrong position, that it was unfortunate, that his service had been noted. I had believed that for 6 years. I would not believe it much longer. My mother, Silna, had been a small woman with dark hair like mine and brown eyes like mine, and a stillness about her that people often mistook for meekness. She was not meek. She was the most deliberately quiet person I have ever known. And I understand now that those are not the same thing at all. She died 3 years after my father. Not from a wound or a battle, from the slow, grinding weight of grief, and something else she never named, something that had been sitting on her chest for years, and finally got heavy enough to stop her heart. She was 38 years old. I was 15. She left me the dress. She left me her habit of pressing her palm flat against the earth on full moon nights, closing her eyes, going very still. I had thought it was just the kind of private ritual grieving people develop, a way of feeling connected to something larger than themselves. I used to watch her from the doorway of our small room in the lower quarters, this woman who had survived so much, kneeling on the cold ground with her hand pressed into the dirt and her lips moving silently. I never asked what she was saying. I wish, with a ferocity that occasionally takes my breath away, that I had asked. She was saying goodbye, I think. She was telling the earth what she could not tell me. The mark appeared on my 18th birthday, 3 weeks before tonight. I woke up with it on the inside of my left wrist, burning softly the way a coal burns when you breathe on it. A crescent moon crossed with a thorn in lines of silver that looked less like something drawn on skin and more like something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to become visible. The elders confirmed it within the hour. Elder Elowen, the oldest of them, with her white hair and her eyes that had seen more decades than anyone cared to count, held my wrist in her papery hands for a long time without speaking. The other elders stood around her in a half circle, and I watched their faces go through a series of expressions I could not read. "Fated mate mark," Elowen said at last, and her voice was carefully, professionally neutral. "You are fated to Corin Ashvale, Alpha of Blackridge." The other elders did not look at me when she said it. Later, much later, I would understand why. What I did not hear, because I was not meant to hear it, was what Elowen said when she thought I had gone far enough down the corridor to be out of range. I had stopped to tie my boot. I was around the corner, crouched on the cold floor. and her words came to me clearly through the acoustics of the stone. "If the bond is rejected before the power is guided," she said, low and urgent, to the elder beside her, "the Lunaris will wake without a shepherd. The girl may not survive the third full moon." I did not know what Lunaris meant. I filed the word away in the back of my mind the way you file something that doesn't make sense yet, trusting that it will eventually, and I finished tying my boot and walked away. The third full moon was 11 days from tonight. I did not know I was counting down to anything. The great hall of Blackridge Mountain was carved out of the living rock of the mountain itself, 300 feet below the surface, lit by iron brackets of torch that ran the length of the walls and made the shadows dance. The ceiling vaulted overhead into darkness. The ancestors' shrine occupied the far wall, a carved arrangement of moonstone and old dark wood polished smooth by generations of hands. It smelled of pine resin and cold stone, and the particular electric charge that gathers when a large number of wolves occupy a small space, all of their instincts pulled toward the same point. 300 wolves, shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting in the cold, their eyes holding that faint amber undertone that surfaced when the pack gathered for something significant. Some of them I had known my entire life. The women who had tolerated me in the kitchen corridors, the guards who had nodded to me on the lower paths, the children who had played in the same courtyards where I had once played as a child. None of them were looking at me with warmth. They were looking at me with the cautious, complicated expression of people who have already decided what to think and are waiting for the facts to confirm it. I stood at the center of the stone floor, exactly where I had been told to stand, and I kept my chin level and my shoulders back, and I breathed. Coran Ashvale stood on the raised dais at the far end of the hall. I had been looking at him from a distance for 3 years. Since the day his father died and he became Alpha at 23, I had watched him the way you watch weather moving across mountains, with a kind of helpless attention you didn't choose and can't quite explain. He was tall and broad-shouldered and darkly handsome in the specific way of men who have never once in their lives been overlooked, with black hair swept back from his forehead and eyes the exact gray of the sky an hour before a storm. He moved like gravity, was a suggestion. I had never spoken to him directly in my life. He was looking at me now, from the dais, with an expression I recognized even though I did not want to. I had seen it on Delara's face. I had seen it on the faces of the high-born women who stepped around me in the corridors as though proximity might be contagious. It was the look of someone who had already decided. Beside him, close enough that her red lacquered fingernails were resting on his forearm, Delara Croft stood in silk the color of deep water. She was beautiful in the way of women who have been told so their entire lives and have built their entire architecture around it. And she was looking at me with a small private smile that she was making absolutely no effort to conceal. Delara Croft, whose father was the Pax Beta, who had shared Coran's bed for 2 years, who had spent our entire childhood finding quiet and methodical ways to make my life smaller, because she had sensed something in me long before I understood what it was. She thought tonight was her victory. She was wrong. But she didn't know that yet. I have called the pack here tonight. Corin's voice was low and resonant and moved through the hall like the first roll of thunder from a storm that is still far away. It was the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to reach every corner of a room. Everything about him was that way. The economy of a man who understood that power does not need to perform itself to address the matter of my fated mate. A murmur moved through the crowd like a wave. I felt my pulse spike once and then steady. My mother's voice arrived in my memory, clear as if she were standing beside me. Whatever pain you face, stand straight. I stood straight. Corin came down from the dais slowly, 3 stone steps, each footfall echoing in the cold silence. The crowd parted for him without thinking about it, the automatic deference of wolves to their alpha, and he walked through that parted crowd until he was 5 feet in front of me. He stopped. He looked at me. Not quickly, not dismissively. He actually looked, his gray eyes moving over my face, my throat, the mark on my wrist, the torn hem of my dress. Something moved in his jaw, a muscle tightening, releasing. I held his gaze and did not look away. The scent of him hit me then, all at once, overwhelming in its specificity. Pine and iron and something wild underneath. Something that made the wolf inside me stand up and press its nose to the bars of its cage and whine with a need so fundamental it bypassed thought entirely. The mate bond. The thing the moon goddess had written in our blood before either of us was born. He felt it too. I watched his nostrils flare. I watched something shift in the gray of his eyes, something that might have been, for just a fraction of a second, something other than contempt. Then he turned his back on me. He faced the pack. I, Corin Ashvale, Alpha of Blackridge, reject Vessa Thorn as my fated mate. The words hit me in the sternum like a fist. I felt the bond snap, that thread I had only just begun to feel over 3 weeks. That fragile and luminous thing that had been growing between us without my permission or his, recoiling like a wire under too much tension. The pain was extraordinary, not metaphorical, physical, radiating from the center of my chest outward, up into my throat, down through my arms, the specific agony of something that was meant to exist being unmade. The hall erupted. Gasps, whispers. Someone in the back let out a low, mournful howl that was cut off almost immediately, swallowed back. Corin turned back to face me. His expression was carved stone. "You are the daughter of a border guard," he said, and his voice was a blade, clean and cold. "You have no lineage, no rank, no power. The moon goddess may have marked you, but I am the alpha of this pack, and I will not be shackled to an omega with nothing to offer this pack but the dirt under her fingernails." The silence after that was of a different quality than the silence before. It was the silence of 300 people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for years. Delara's smile widened behind her hand. I felt the eyes of the room on me like heat. 300 pairs of them pressing in from every direction, measuring, waiting, anticipating the particular satisfaction of watching someone fall apart in public. I felt the rejection bond burning in my chest like a live coal. I felt my wolf, my poor confused small wolf, whimpering inside me, circling the place where the bond had been, unable to understand why our mate had torn us apart. And then I noticed something. The pain was real. It was extraordinary. It was the worst thing I had ever felt in my body. But it was not making me smaller. It was not pushing me down. It was doing something else entirely. Something I had no name for yet. Something that felt less like breaking and more like a door swinging open on a room that had been sealed for a very long time. I looked at Corin Ashvale, this man who had called me nothing. This man who had turned his back on what the goddess herself had written between us. This man who was standing in front of 300 witnesses, radiating the absolute certainty of someone who has never once been wrong about anything in his life. And I laughed. It came up from somewhere deep, not from the part of me that was in pain, but from somewhere underneath the pain, some bedrock layer of myself that the pain had cracked open and revealed. It was a real laugh. Genuine, unafraid, the sound of someone who has just understood something important. The hall went utterly silent. Corin's expression fractured for just a moment. Not much. A slight widening of those storm gray eyes. A small disruption in the absolute certainty, gone in an instant, replaced immediately by something cold and sharp. "What?" he said. Not a question. A warning. I let the laugh finish, and then I looked at him steadily. "Oh, Corin," I said, and my voice was quiet and clear and carried to every corner of that stone room without effort, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. "You really do think you're the most powerful thing in this room?" His eyes flared amber. A growl built in his chest, low and resonant, the kind of sound that was meant to send wolves to their knees. I did not move. "I accept your rejection," I said, and the word accept landed differently than he expected, not like a surrender, but like a verdict. "I accept it freely and completely, because you just made the biggest mistake of your life. And you don't know it yet, but you will." I held his gaze for one more breath. Then I turned on my bare heel and I walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for me. I did not ask them to. I did not push through. They simply moved, stepping back on instinct, creating a path. And I walked through it with my chin level and my shoulders back, and my mother's torn dress trailing behind me, and the mark on my wrist pulsing with a light that was just beginning to build. Behind me, Corin's voice rang out across the stone. "You are nothing, Vessa Thorn. You will always be nothing." I did not look back. I did not need to, because the mark on my wrist had stopped burning with the pain of the broken bond. In its place, something else had begun, something older and deeper and vast, something that had been sleeping inside my blood for 300 years, waiting in the specific patient way of things that know their moment is coming. He had not broken me. He had unlocked me. I walked out of the great hall of Black Ridge Mountain and into the dark, and I did not stop walking until the torchlight was gone, and the cold of the mountain night was on my skin, and the ancient trees of the Thornwood rose ahead of me like the threshold of another world. Behind me, in the sealed and breathless hall, 300 wolves stood in the silence I had left them in, and Corin Ashvale stood alone at the center of it, staring at the empty space where I had been, with an expression that no one in that room had ever seen on his face before. Something that looked, for just a moment, like doubt. The Thornwood did not frighten me. That was the first strange thing I noticed, stepping past the boundary markers where the last torchlight from Black Ridge's outer walls faded into nothing behind me. Every wolf in the pack had been raised on the same stories about this forest. Do not enter after dark. The trees are too old, and the roots run too deep, and the things that live between the shadows do not distinguish between friend and stranger. Children who wandered in did not always wander back out. Even the pack's most seasoned hunters gave the Thornwood's edge a wide berth when the sun went down, and no patrol route in living memory had ever been drawn to include the interior. I walked into it like I was walking home. The cold hit immediately, sharper and cleaner than the cold inside the mountain, the kind of cold that has no malice in it, only honesty. My bare feet sank into moss and leaf litter, soft and damp and carrying the smell of deep earth, of things that had been growing and dying and growing again in this same dark soil for longer than the pack's 400-year history. The trees here were enormous, their trunks wider than 3 men standing with arms spread, their bark deeply furrowed and dark with age, their roots rising from the earth in great curved arches, like the bones of something that had decided to grow rather than be buried. Above me, the canopy closed over completely, blocking the stars, and the darkness became total and somehow, inexplicably, not frightening at all. I kept walking. I want to be honest about the state I was in, because the story is less true if I make myself braver than I was. The pain from the broken bond was still moving through my chest in long, slow radiations, like the aftershock of something that has struck too hard. The particular agony of a thing that was meant to exist being unmade before it had the chance to fully form. 3 weeks. I had felt the threat of it for 3 weeks, growing incrementally stronger each day, a new and tender awareness of another consciousness moving through the world at some distance from me. I had not wanted to feel it. I had told myself every morning that it meant nothing, that fated bonds were not choices, and therefore not obligations, that the mark on my wrist was a cosmic accident rather than a design. I had been lying to myself, the way you lie to yourself when the truth is too large and too uncertain to hold yet, and you need more time to grow into it. Now the thread was gone, severed with a clean and public brutality that had left a wound in its absence, a hollow in my chest that the cold air kept finding. And beneath the hollow, something else was moving. Something warm. I noticed it first as a low, continuous heat in my left wrist, different in quality from the burning of the broken bond, less like injury and more like a fire being carefully and deliberately fed. I pressed my right hand over the mark as I walked, feeling the pulse of it against my palm, steady and rhythmic and purposeful. The pulse of something that had been waiting and had now, for reasons it did not feel the need to explain, decided it was time to stop waiting. My mother's voice arrived in my memory without warning, the way her voice always did, at unexpected angles, carrying things I had not known I needed. She used to walk in the dark. I was 12, maybe 13. A winter night, cold enough that the inside walls of our small room in the lower quarters had a thin rime of moisture that froze before morning. I woke to something I could not name, some absence where there should have been presence, and looked to the corner where her sleeping mat was. Empty. I found her outside, on the narrow strip of frozen ground between the lower quarters building and the mountain wall, a space so unremarkable it had no name, used for nothing and visited by no one. She was barefoot in the snow. Her hand was pressed flat against the frozen earth, palm down, fingers spread. Her eyes were closed, and her lips were moving in something too quiet to hear. I had called her name. She had not answered for a long moment, and when she finally opened her eyes and looked at me across the dark, there had been an expression on her face that I had filed away carefully and never quite been able to categorize. I had labeled it grief and relief, those two things braided together, because that was the closest my 12-year-old vocabulary could get. I understood now walking through the Thornwood with the mark pulsing against my palm, that I had been wrong. It had not been grief and relief. It had been recognition. The specific expression of a person being recognized by something vast that has been looking for them for a long time. The face of someone who has been carrying a secret so large it has become indistinguishable from the self, finally, briefly, in the dark and cold and solitude of a winter night, allowed to set it down. She had not been grieving in those moments. She had been maintaining herself, keeping a connection alive that had to be kept alive, feeding something in the earth that fed her in return, a reciprocal communication that she could not explain to me without explaining everything else. And explaining everything else would have exposed what we were and what I would become. And she had decided, with the terrified and absolute love of a mother who had survived things I did not yet know she had survived, that I would be safer not knowing. She had been wrong about that, but she had made the choice from love, and love is rarely wrong in its source, even when it errs in its execution. I pressed my palm flat against a tree trunk as I passed it, and felt, so faint it was nearly nothing, a vibration in the bark. Not wind, not the settling of old wood. Something responsive. Something that registered my touch and answered it with the minimal acknowledgement of something very large, noticing something very small, with cautious interest. An hour ago, I would have told myself I was imagining it. I kept my hand on the bark for 3 full breaths and let it know I was listening. Then I kept walking. The forest deepened around me as I went further in. The trees grew closer together, their canopies merging overhead into an unbroken ceiling of dark, and the ground beneath my feet changed from moss and leaf litter to something softer and more deliberate, the kind of ground that feels tended even though no human hands have tended it, the way old sacred places feel tended by the attention that has been paid to them across generations. The air changed too, losing the sharp mineral cold of the upper mountain and gaining something layered and complex, earth and old wood, and the ghost of summer rain, and beneath all of it an electric undercurrent, the smell of a charge building. I was far beyond the boundary markers now, far beyond the patrol routes, far beyond the point where even the most reckless of the pack's young wolves dared each other to go on a dare. The silence here was not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The silence of things that are very old and very aware, choosing to be still. I was not afraid. I want to keep saying this because it kept surprising me. This absence of fear in a place that had been built up in my imagination as the source of all the fears. I had been afraid in the great hall tonight, that ordinary human fear of being witnessed in humiliation, the animal shrinking that comes from standing in the center of a crowd that has decided to enjoy your pain. I had been afraid every day of my life in small accumulating ways, the fear of taking up too much space, of being seen and found wanting, of reaching for something and being told my hands were the wrong kind of hands for reaching. None of that fear was here. What was here instead was the warm pulse in my wrist, growing stronger with every step, and a sensation I could only describe as being walked toward something rather than walking toward it, a gentle, inexorable pull, directional and purposeful, the feeling of following a path that has always existed even though it has never been marked. I turned between 2 trees whose trunks had grown so close together over so many centuries that their bark had fused at chest height, creating an arch, and stepped through into the clearing. It was a perfect circle, 30 feet across, maybe more, ringed by the oldest trees I had ever seen, their trunks so massive and so ancient they seemed less like trees and more like standing stones that had decided over millennia to put out bark and branches. They leaned inward slightly, the way listeners lean toward a speaker, as if the clearing at their center was the source of something they had been attending to for a very long time. The ground was warm, not slightly warmer than the surrounding forest. Genuinely, substantively warm. The warmth of a hearthstone that has had a fire on it all day. A warmth that came from deep below the surface and radiated upward steadily and without variation. I stood at the edge of the clearing and pressed my bare foot more firmly into the ground and felt it clearly, warmth rising through the soles of my feet and into my ankles, into my calves. A warmth that felt less like temperature and more like welcome. The air in the clearing smelled of ozone, sharp and clean, and night-blooming jasmine so strong it was almost visible. And beneath both of those, something that had no name in any language I knew, something ancient and lucid and electric that made the inside of my chest vibrate at a frequency just below hearing. The moon hung directly overhead, perfectly centered in the circle of canopy, as if the trees had arranged themselves with this specific purpose in mind, the full silver weight of it framed and presented by the clearing like an offering. Its light fell straight down into the space in a concentrated column, not diffuse as moonlight usually is, but focused, intentional, the light of something paying attention. And it was warm. That was the thing that undid me, finally. After everything else that had happened tonight, the moonlight was warm. I had lived under the moon my entire life, and it had always been cold, the blue-white cold of reflected light, beautiful and remote, and entirely indifferent to the small, warm creatures living their small, warm lives beneath it. This light fell on my upturned face like the touch of a hand that knew me, like my mother's hand. I made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite anything else, and I walked to the center of the clearing. I did not kneel immediately. I stood for a while in the column of warm moonlight and let myself feel the full weight of the night, the rejection and the grief and the pain and the long, exhausting accumulation of being insufficient in the specific way that I had been insufficient my entire life, not for lack of trying, but for lack of being born into the right bloodline, the right family, the right tier of a hierarchy that I had never chosen and never endorsed. I let myself feel all of it. Then I let myself feel the thing underneath it. The thing underneath it was not anger, though I had expected anger. It was not triumph, though some small and honest part of me had been hoping for triumph. The thing underneath all the pain and grief and exhaustion was something much quieter and much more durable than either of those. It was a kind of clarity, the specific clarity that arrives when all the noise of a situation has finally been stripped away and what remains is the simple true shape of what is. What was, I had been born to carry something I had not been told about. The people who should have told me had protected me instead, with the best love they knew how to give. And they were gone now, both of them, and I was alone in a clearing in the middle of a forbidden forest, with warm light falling on my face, and something very large pressing up from below the surface of myself, asking to be let in. I could refuse. I could walk back to Blackridge and accept the life of a rejected Omega, carrying the secret to my grave the way my mother had. I thought about Pip, about what I would be leaving her to, if I chose that. I thought about the 300 wolves in the Great Hall, the Omegas pressed to the back walls, the ones who had learned to make themselves as flat and invisible as possible because visibility invited cruelty. The mid-ranked wolves who had watched me walk out and felt something they could not name, some small tentative movement in the direction of a question they had not previously known they were allowed to ask. I thought about my mother, kneeling in the snow with her palm pressed to frozen ground, choosing every single day of her life to stay small so I could grow up safe. I thought, her sacrifice should mean something. It should mean more than me choosing the same smallness she chose, perpetuating the erasure one more generation, handing the secret to a grave instead of to the world. I sank to my knees, not in defeat and not in submission, in surrender, which is a completely different thing. Surrender is what you do when you finally understand that the current is moving in the direction you need to go, and fighting it is only costing you strength you could spend on swimming. I pressed both palms flat against the warm earth of the clearing, and I breathed. A woman standing on a cliff above a sea that was tearing itself apart in a storm. Silver hair loose in the wind, moving like something alive, eyes open and glowing white, not from within, but from without, as if light was entering her through them rather than emerging. Her face, utterly still, not afraid. The specific stillness of someone who is so much a part of the forces around her that the storm's violence does not constitute a threat so much as a condition of being. Her name arrived with her. Kaelindra, the first, the source, more arrived with her name. A battle on a gray plain, dawn light arriving thin and cold on the left horizon, wolves the size of draft horses moving across the ground in organized formation. Not fighting the shadow creatures with fang and claw alone, but with light, with that particular quality of presence that Kaelindra carried in her eyes. The light that did not destroy the darkness, but made it impossible. The way you cannot have shadow in the direct center of noon sun. The shadow creatures did not die. They simply ceased to be able to maintain the coherence required for existence in the presence of that light. More, a hall carved from living rock. Hundreds of torches, a throne made of wood that had been grown rather than cut, twisted and polished and set with stones that held light inside them like amber holds insects, preserving something that would otherwise be lost. A figure on the throne whose face I could not see, but whose presence I could feel even through the removed and dreamlike quality of the vision. A presence so fundamental that every wolf in the scene had their heads slightly lowered and their shoulders slightly eased, the unconscious physical expression of being in a place where you are completely and unconditionally safe. And then, my mother, younger than I had ever seen her, younger than I was now, standing in a field at night, dark hair loose, eyes closed, palms pressed against the earth in the exact position mine were in now, and on her face, clear even across the distance of memory and vision, recognition, the face of someone being found by something that has been looking for them for a long time. She had known from the beginning. She had been born knowing, and she had looked at the world she was born into, at the fate of Kaelindra, at the 3 centuries of deliberate erasure that had followed, at the way power that cannot be controlled is always eventually destroyed by those who fear it. And she had made a choice. She had chosen me over herself, over her legacy, over the full expression of what she was. She had folded herself down to the size of a border guard's wife and a border guard's widow, and a woman dying quietly in a small room in the lower quarters. and she had done it so that I could have the childhood she did not trust the world to give me if it knew what I was. My father had known. The memory arrived with the absolute certainty of inherited knowledge. Eden Thorne had known exactly what his wife was when he married her, and he had loved her more completely for it, not less. He had spent 20 years on the southern border with the particular vigilance of a man who understood that what he was protecting was more important than anything he could name. And when they came, when someone finally found the thread and began following it back, he had not hesitated. He had run toward them, on purpose, with full knowledge of what it meant. He had given them something to follow that led away from us. I was kneeling in the clearing, crying in a way I had not cried since I was 15, and my mother did not wake up, deep and gutting and completely silent. And also, I was more certain of anything than I had ever been in my life. The two things coexisted without contradiction, grief and clarity, fully occupying the same space. I pressed my hands harder into the warm earth. I opened myself to what was rising. The pain in my chest detonated like something structural giving way. All of it at once, the broken bond and the grief and the humiliation and the 18 years of careful smallness and the specific cruelty of being called nothing in front of everyone I had ever known by the person the moon had written into my blood as the other half of something. It rose in a single enormous wave and crested, and I made a sound that I will not describe, and I bent forward over my own hands with my forehead nearly touching the warm ground. 10 seconds. Maybe 15, and then my mother's voice, not memory, not echo, something more immediate and more present than either of those things, said with calm and absolute certainty, "Stand straight, Vessa." I straightened. At the place where the wave had crested, at the deepest point of the pain, I found what my mother had always known was there. A bedrock layer of self that the pain had been trying to reach for the specific purpose of finding out what it was made of. And what it was made of was something that did not move. Not stone, which is rigid and can be broken. Something more like the deep root systems of very old trees, which bend in storms that would shatter stone but hold, because they are connected to everything below them. I was connected to everything below me. I opened my hands. The clearing blazed. Silver lines erupted from beneath my palms, racing outward across the surface of the warm earth in every direction. A network of light so complex and so vast that for a moment I could not take in its full scope. Ley lines. The word arrived with complete understanding attached. The veins of the earth through which the moon's power moved continuously. The invisible architecture that connected every sacred place, every old forest, every mountain and valley and river to every other. An unbroken web of lunar energy that had been running beneath the surface of the world since before wolves had words for what they were. Usually unseen, usually imperceptible to anything except those very old or very specifically gifted. I could see all of it, every line converging on this clearing from every direction, meeting beneath my palms like rivers meeting the sea, then running outward again, carrying something with them that had not been there before. When I raised my hands and looked at them, pale, cold fire moved across my skin, not burning, not painful, simply present. Silver light that shifted and breathed the way a flame shifts and breathes. I looked at my left wrist. The crescent and thorn mark was gone. What was there instead pulsed with a slow and certain light, a full moon cradled in the spreading antlers of a silver stag, drawn in lines so fine they might have been made by a single hair, beating in perfect time with my heart, the sigil of the Lunaris bloodline. The mark my mother had carried hidden under the surface of her skin for her entire life. The mark of Kalindra's surviving line, thought extinct for 300 years. I pressed my thumb over it and felt it pulse against my touch like a second heartbeat. My wolf, which had been whimpering and lost and circling the ruins of the broken bond since the moment Corin said the words, went utterly still. Then it rose. I felt it the way you feel a door open in a room you were certain had no doors. A sudden expansion of interior space, a new dimension of self unfolding from somewhere it had been compressed into invisibility for 18 years. The wolf that rose inside me was not the small gray creature that the pack's warriors had dismissed and the pack's children had mocked, and Corin's wolf had apparently not considered worth the courtesy of acknowledgement. This wolf was the color of moonlight on snow. Its eyes held the specific cold brilliance of stars seen from altitude, and it did not merely carry the wolf spirit the way all wolves carry their inner animal, as a companion sharing a body. It carried the moon, the actual living presence of the moon, or something so close to that presence that distinguishing between them was a question of degree rather than kind. I understood everything at once, kneeling in the blazing clearing with ley lines bright beneath me and the sigil beating on my wrist and 300 years of erased history suddenly fully legible in my blood. The rejection had not been a wound. It had been a key turning in a lock that had been waiting, patient and certain, for exactly this hand. My mother had been wrong about one thing. She had believed that keeping me small would keep the power dormant. She had not accounted for the possibility that the power required precisely what had happened tonight to wake: a public breaking, a witnessed humiliation, the specific devastation of being called nothing by the person the moon had chosen as the instrument of awakening. She had not accounted for the moon goddess's particular sense of timing, or her particular sense of poetry. Or perhaps she had known at the very end, and had made peace with it. I stood up. My legs were steady beneath me with a steadiness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with foundation. The torn cotton dress was gone. In its place was something that the forest had provided without my asking, something that moved around me like shadow with intention, dark as the space between stars and threaded through with the same silver light that ran in the ley lines beneath the ground. My hair, when a strand of it fell across my face, was threaded at the tips with white that held the moonlight the way fiber holds dye, permanently, completely. I looked down at myself and felt, for the first time in my life, that the outside matched the inside. I looked up at the moon. Then I opened my mouth and I howled. It came from below the place where sound originates, not from the throat, not from the chest, from somewhere below both of those, from the place where the ley lines converged, from the junction of the earth's deep power and whatever was moving through me as its current expression. It was not the howl I had known my entire life, the pack's voice, the wolf's voice, the sound that said, "I am here and I am one of you." It was something prior to language and more fundamental than belonging. It was the sound of a frequency that the natural world was structured to respond to. It shook the trees. The oldest ones, the ones that had been standing since before the pack had a name, trembled in their roots. The sound split the sky of the clearing in a clean division of before and after, and rolled outward in all directions, and it did not diminish with distance the way sound diminishes. It carried. It found what it was looking for. Every bird in the Thornwood rose simultaneously, a dark eruption from the canopy in all directions at once. Every creature within the forest's boundaries pressed itself against the ground. The ley lines blazed blinding white and then softened to their steady silver pulse. And 30 miles away, in the great hall of Black Ridge Mountain, every wolf felt it, not with their ears, in the marrow of their bones, in the oldest animal stratum of themselves, below thought and below training, and below the entire constructed architecture of the pack's hierarchy, a call so fundamental that it reached through all of that and found the bedrock animal that existed before any of it and spoke directly to that animal in a language it could not disobey. Every wolf in the pack dropped their belly to the floor in the same instant. Every wolf bared their throat. 300 wolves in an ancient stone hall, from the lowest Omega child to the most decorated warrior, simultaneous and involuntary and complete. Corin Ashvale felt his wolf, the massive black beast that had been his constant companion and his primary instrument of power for 26 years. The wolf that had never in its life submitted to anything, flatten itself inside him with a sound he had never heard it make before. A sound like acknowledgement, like recognition, like a creature that has been operating under a misapprehension and has just had it corrected. Coran's knees did not buckle. He caught himself, but the hand he caught himself with gripped the edge of the dais so hard the stone cracked beneath his fingers, and the sound that left his chest was not the sound of an alpha in control of his hall. It was the sound of a man who has just understood, too late and in the worst possible way, that he was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. 47 minutes. That was the time between the moment I had walked out of the great hall with Corin's voice following me and the moment I walked back in. I counted my own heartbeats for the last portion of the walk, that new steady pulse that matched the ley lines and the sigil and the moon overhead. Not to measure time, because the rhythm was grounding, because it reminded me with each beat what I was made of and what I had come to do. The 2 gate guards saw me at 50 yards. I watched the recognition arrive on their faces, and I watched what followed it. The immediate and helpless response of their wolves surging to the surface, and then pressing down in submission before the men had consciously processed what they were seeing. One of them reached for the gate mechanism with a hand that shook visibly. I did not ask them to open the gates. I simply arrived, and the gates opened, and I walked through. The corridors of Black Ridge had changed in 47 minutes, not physically. The stone was the same stone, the torches the same torches, the air holding the same complex smell of wolf and iron and cold mountain. But the quality of the silence was completely different. When I had walked out, the silence had been the silence of shock, of 300 wolves not knowing what to do with what they had just witnessed. This silence was different. This was the silence of something waiting. Wolves came out of doorways as I passed. They did not crowd me. They lined the corridor walls on both sides and stood with their eyes wide and their wolves pushing up against the surface of them, and I felt through the thing that was building inside me. Not yet a bond, but the architecture of one, the shape of their emotions. confusion and awe and fear, and something underneath all of those that was larger and older than any of them. Something that had been sleeping in this pack the way power had been sleeping in my blood, waiting for a specific kind of disruption to wake it. Hope. That was what I was feeling from them, raw and unformed and almost unbearably tender. The hope of people who have not allowed themselves to hope for a long time and are not yet sure it is safe to do so. By the time I reached the Great Hall, there were more than 100 wolves walking behind me in perfect silence. I pressed both hands against the Great Hall's iron doors, felt them, cold and solid and very old, against my palms, pushed, and walked back into the room where Corin Ashvale had called me nothing, with the ley lines still burning in my blood and the moon's mark blazing on my wrist, and 100 wolves at my back, into the silence that broke open at the sight of me, like a wave that has finally reached the shore it was always traveling toward. The Great Hall had not moved, but everything inside it had shifted. I felt it the moment the iron doors swung open beneath my hands, a change in the quality of the air that was less about temperature and more about pressure, the specific atmospheric weight of 300 people who have been standing in stunned and leaderless silence for the better part of an hour, waiting for something to happen without knowing what shape the something would take. Now it had a shape. Now it had my shape. The torches along the walls flared as I crossed the threshold, every flame simultaneously reaching higher for a half-second before settling back, as if the fire itself had taken a breath. The shadows jumped and danced, and the wolves nearest the doors, the ones who had remained in the hall rather than following me into the corridors, turned toward the sound of the opening doors and went still in a way that was different from the stillness of shock. This was the stillness of animals in the presence of something their instincts do not have a category for. I walked in. Behind me, the 100 wolves who had followed me through the corridors entered and arranged themselves along the walls without being directed, a quiet and orderly filling of space, as if they understood that what was about to happen required witnesses, and they had elected themselves to the role. The iron doors swung shut behind the last of them with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Coran was standing at the center of the hall. He had not moved to the dais. He was on the main floor, in the open stone space where I had been standing when he rejected me, surrounded by the tight cluster of his inner circle. Orrin Croft to his left, the beta's broad shoulders and iron gray hair carrying the particular rigidity of a man maintaining composure through considerable effort. Brecken to his right, the gamma's massive frame utterly still in the way that large and dangerous things go still when they are genuinely uncertain. A handful of senior warriors arranged loosely behind them, expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained alarm, and Delara, standing so close to Corin that her shoulder was against his arm, her red lacquered fingers wrapped around his forearm with a grip that had moved past possessive into something closer to desperate, though she would never have admitted that. Her silk dress caught the torchlight. Her dark eyes found me the moment I entered, and her face went through 3 rapid expressions before settling on one that was trying very hard to look like contempt, and not quite succeeding. Corin's face was the one I looked at last, because I wanted to look at it clearly, and I needed a moment to be ready for what I would find there. He was white, not pale. White, the blood drained from his skin with a thoroughness that made him look like a different person than the man who had stood on the dais an hour ago, radiating the absolute certainty of someone who has never been wrong. His jaw was set. His eyes were fully amber, his wolf so far forward in him that the human gray of his irises had been entirely consumed. His hands were at his sides, both of them, which meant he had disengaged from Delara's grip or she had released him, and they were clenched into fists with the white-knuckled tension of a man who is using every physical mechanism available to him to stay upright. His wolf was screaming at him. I could feel it, not through any bond we still shared. We had no bond. He had made certain of that. But through something broader and less specific, the general awareness of the Lunaris that extended outward through the pack like roots through soil. His wolf was not confused. His wolf knew exactly what I was and was responding with the instinctive, involuntary deference of a creature that has just encountered something on a scale above its own in the hierarchy. Not the social hierarchy that Quran had built and maintained through strength and strategy and the accumulated politics of a quarter century, but the older hierarchy, the one written before packs had names. His pride was the only thing keeping him on his feet. His pride and his stubborn, magnificent, infuriating refusal to accept that something had happened tonight that fell outside the boundaries of his understanding of how the world was structured. "What?" he said. His voice came out wrong, not as a command, not as the Alpha's voice that could roll thunder through stone halls. It came out smaller than that, a single syllable carrying more confusion and more fear than I suspected he had ever allowed anyone to hear from him in his life. "What are you?" I stopped at the center of the hall, the same stone, the same precise spot where I had stood in my mother's torn dress an hour ago while he told me I was nothing. I stood there now, with the Lunaris sigil burning silver on my wrist and the moonlight of the forest still alive in my blood, and I let him look at me for a long moment before I answered. "You asked that wrong," I said, and my voice was layered again, the way it had been in the clearing when I howled. That quality of depth beneath the surface sound. A second voice speaking underneath the first, older and more resonant and carrying the specific authority of something that does not need to assert itself because it simply is. The question is not what I am. The question is what I have always been. I raised my right hand, palm forward, so that the hall could see the sigil blazing on my wrist. The reaction moved through the room in a wave, starting at the front and rolling backward to the walls. Gasps. Several wolves near the center stumbling backward a step before catching themselves. A sound from the back of the hall, someone's wolf breaking through their composure and letting out a single, involuntary whine before being swallowed back. And from the left side of the room, from the cluster of elders who had remained through the night, a sound that was completely different from all the others. Elder Elowen. She was on her knees before I had registered her moving. This ancient woman with her white hair and her centuries of accumulated knowledge and her face that was streaming silently with tears she seemed entirely unaware of. She was on her knees with her head bowed and her hands pressed flat against the stone floor, and she was saying something, repeating it, and the word moved through the hall like a stone dropped in still water. Lunaris. That single word. And the entire quality of the room changed again. The elders who recognized it reacted first. 3 of them went to their knees alongside Elowen, immediately and without hesitation, the deference of people who had spent their lives knowing this word and never expecting to hear it spoken in living context. The older warriors shifted, some of them, their faces showing the complicated expression of people encountering a reference they half know, a story they heard as children that is suddenly, bewilderingly real. Ilawan lifted her face to me, and her expression was everything. Reverence and grief and relief and wonder, all of it moving across the wrinkled map of her face at once. "The bloodline," she said, and her voice was not steady. Moon-blessed. It survived. I looked at her for a moment with the full weight of what I now knew sitting in my chest. "My mother hid what we were," I said, and I said it clearly enough for the full hall to hear. "She made herself a border guard's wife so that no one would look at her twice. She kept the secret because the last Lunaris who allowed herself to be known was betrayed by the alphas she had healed and protected. She chose to protect me above everything else, above herself, above her legacy, above the full life she was entitled to live." The silence in the hall had changed again. It was listening now. The specific quality of attention that gathers when a room full of people simultaneously understands that what they are hearing is going to matter for a long time. My gaze moved to Orrin Croft. He had not moved from his position at Corin's left. He was still standing. His face was the face of a man in the middle of a private reckoning that he had known, on some level, was eventually going to arrive. "You knew," I said. Not a question. Orrin Croft closed his eyes. "He knew about my mother's bloodline," I continued, and my voice was still quiet, still without anger in the sense of heat, though it was not without weight. He knew what I would become. He kept the knowledge because he told himself it was safer for the pack to have the Lunaris dormant and hidden. And because a Lunaris who was known and awake would have made the Beta's family's position significantly less significant. The hall was completely silent. Orrin opened his eyes. He did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the floor. "I believed I was making the right choice," he said. His voice was stripped of the Beta's authority. Just a man's voice. The voice of someone who is holding something heavy and has held it long enough to be tired. I was wrong. He lowered himself to his knees. Not quickly, not in the all-at-once collapse of someone whose body has given up the fight. Slowly, deliberately. The choice of a man rather than the surrender of a wolf. Beside him, I felt rather than saw the moment Delara understood the full shape of what her father had just admitted. The sharp inhale, the slight sway. Her grip on Corin's arm tightened and then released entirely. She stepped forward. "This is dark magic," she said, and her voice only trembled slightly, which was more composure than the situation warranted. "She is using something. Corin, don't let her do this. You are the alpha of this pack, and she is an omega who has no right to stand in this hall and—" I did not turn my head toward her. I did not raise my voice. I simply shifted the weight of the Lunaris aura, the barest fraction of it, the way you shift the angle of a mirror to redirect light, and aimed it toward the source of the sound. Delara's knees struck the stone floor so hard, I heard her teeth click together. Her eyes went fully amber, her wolf surging forward, and the sound that came out of her throat was not a sound she chose to make. A high and desperate and involuntary note of complete submission that seemed to surprise her more than anyone else in the room. She was on her hands and knees, with her head bowed and her neck exposed before the conscious part of her mind had caught up with what her body was doing. The hall went dead silent. I looked at her for a moment. Not with triumph. Not even with the satisfaction I might have expected to feel, standing over a woman who had spent years finding small and patient ways to make my life smaller. What I felt looking at Delara Croft on the stone floor was something closer to pity. And beneath that, a clear and uncomplicated recognition of what she was. Not a villain, not a monster. A person who had been given power she did not earn, and had spent years making certain that no one around her grew large enough to throw it into question. A person whose entire architecture was built on someone else's smallness. I am not using dark magic, I said quietly, to the hall, rather than to her. I am not using any magic at all. This is dominance, the kind the moon goddess gives, not the kind you build through politics and fear. I lifted my eyes from Delara and let my gaze travel the full arc of the hall. One by one, they knelt. The Omegas first, the ones pressed to the back walls, the lowest-ranked wolves who were most sensitively attuned to dominance shifts, and felt this one before they could think about resisting it. They went down easy, and what I felt from them through the building awareness was not reluctance. It was the release of a tension so long held it had become invisible. The relief of people who have been bracing against something for years finally being allowed to stop. The mid-ranks next, the hunters and scouts and healers, their wolves louder than their uncertainty. Then the warriors, slower, more reluctant, trained specifically to resist dominance challenges. But this was not a dominance challenge in the sense their training accounted for. This was something below training, something at the level at which the wolf existed before the pack had rules. Brecken, the Gamma. 6.5 feet of scarred and battle-tested wolf, the kind of man who had never kneeled to anything in his life that he had not chosen to kneel to. He went down hard, both knees, the crack of contact with the stone audible throughout the hall, and the sound that came from him was something between a sob and an exhale, and the tears running down his scarred face were entirely outside his awareness or control. The hall watched him kneel, and something shifted in the watching, a collective recognition that if Brecken had gone down, the question was no longer if, but when. And then there was only Corin, standing alone in a sea of kneeling wolves. His whole body was shaking. I could see it from where I stood, the fine tremor running through his arms and shoulders, the sweat at his temples, the veins standing out in his neck with the effort of what he was doing, which was using every resource available to him to remain standing against a force that had already brought every other wolf in the room to their knees. His pride, that was what was holding him up. His stubborn, magnificent, infuriating pride, and the 6 years of identity he had built around being the most powerful wolf in this mountain, and some deeper and more fundamental resistance. The resistance of a man who understands that when he kneels, something he has been his entire life will be different on the other side of it. He was right about that. I walked toward him, slowly, deliberately, mirroring the way he had walked toward me earlier tonight, those measured and resonant footsteps that had echoed in the cold air while 300 wolves watched and waited. I stopped when we were close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the amber of his eyes fracturing as his wolf and his will tore at each other, close enough to smell the pine and iron and wild thing scent of him, that scent that had nearly undone me an hour ago when it carried the mate bond's recognition. The mate bond was gone. What remained was something else, something I did not yet have a name for. I looked up at him. He was a foot taller. It did not matter. "Kneel," I said. One word. Not a shout. Not a command in the sense of force applied from outside. A word spoken quietly, with the full and unhurried weight of the moon behind it, the way a river bank does not command the water, but simply presents the shape that the water will take. Karan's legs buckled. He went down hard. Both knees, hands flat on the stone, head bowed forward so that I was looking at the back of his neck, the dark hair damp with sweat at the nape. The sound that tore from him was half growl and half something rawer than growl, the sound of a man releasing something he has been carrying in his chest for a very long time without knowing it was weight. His whole body shook. I reached down and placed my hand on the top of his bowed head. He went still beneath my touch. Not the stillness of submission, not the stillness of a broken thing, the stillness of something that has finally been given permission to stop fighting. I felt his wolf, the massive black beast, uncurl from its defensive crouch inside him and lift its head. I felt something in his chest ease, a tension releasing, the specific physiological relief of a body that has been at war with itself finally being allowed to stop. "I do not want your throne," I said, and my voice was only mine now. The layered resonance receded. Just Vessa. Just the girl in the clearing with the warm earth under her hands. "I do not want your submission. I am not here to take what you have built." I stepped back, let my hand fall. "But things are going to change," I said. And I looked up and let my gaze travel the full hall, the 300 wolves kneeling on cold stone in the torchlight. From the oldest elder to the youngest Omega child who had crept in to watch from the back corner. I let them all know they were seen. Every one of them. Not as a mass, not as a pack, but as individuals, each one specific and whole, and carrying the weight of their own particular life. All of it. Everything is going to change. The first thing I did was sit down on the floor. Not the dais, not the raised stone platform at the far end of the hall where the alpha's seat commanded the room and every wolf in it was positioned lower, physically lower. A geometry of power so deeply embedded in Black Ridge's architecture that no one seemed to have noticed it was a choice rather than a law. I walked to the center of the main floor, the same stone I had stood on twice tonight already, and I sat down cross-legged on the cold, hard ground, and I looked at the 300 wolves still arranged around the walls of the hall in the stunned and kneeling silence of people who have not yet been told what comes next. "Rise," I said. "All of you." They rose, slowly, uncertainly, with the careful movements of people testing whether the ground beneath them had actually changed, or whether it only felt that way. The Omegas from the back walls straightened last, as if they expected the instruction to be rescinded before it reached them. It did not. I looked at the space around me, at the stone floor, swept clean and cold, and offering no softness, at the iron brackets of torch that threw their unsteady light across 300 faces, each one carrying its own particular mixture of confusion and awe and the fragile beginning of something that had not yet decided what it was. "Sit down," I said, "if you want to. There is no requirement, but I am going to be here for a while and the floor is going to be hard, regardless of whether you are standing or sitting." A pause, a long one, and then, from near the left wall, A wolf, I recognized. One of the kitchen workers, a mid-ranked woman named Bet, who had worked the lower kitchens for as long as I could remember, lowered herself carefully to the floor. She did not look at anyone when she did it. She just sat. After Bet, others followed. Slowly, in ones and twos, and then in small clusters, the hall rearranging itself from the formal standing assembly of a ceremony into something that had no precedent in the 400-year history of Black Ridge Mountain. Karan remained standing. He had moved back to the edge of the hall, near the dais steps, but not on them, and he stood with his arms at his sides, and his expression carefully arranged into something that was trying to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. I could feel through the nascent awareness of the Lunaris the war still happening inside him, pride and instinct, and something newer and rawer that had no name yet. His wolf was quiet now. The frantic internal struggle settled into something resigned and attentive. The wolf, at least, had accepted what tonight meant. The man was still working on it. I turned my attention to the hall. "I want to hear from you," I said. "Any of you. About anything. About what this pack is and what it should be. And what you have needed that you have not been given, and what you have been given that you did not ask for. I will not punish anyone for what they say. I will not remember it against you. I am asking because I genuinely do not know, and I need to know, and the only people who can tell me are the ones who have been living inside it." The silence that followed was of a particular and recognizable quality. I had grown up producing exactly this kind of silence when faced with an invitation that felt too exposed to accept. The silence of people who want to speak and are calculating, automatically and from long habit, what it might cost them. I let it sit. I did not fill it. I did not soften the invitation with reassurances or qualifications. I just waited, the way the clearing and the Thornwood had waited for me when I needed it, without urgency, without pressure, trusting that the right thing would happen when the person in front of me was ready for it to happen. The first night, no one spoke. The second night, 3 people offered brief and cautious observations, more questions than statements, phrased in the way of people who have learned to test the temperature before committing any weight. The third night, Pip spoke. She was sitting near the back of the hall, this 7-year-old girl with her dark, serious eyes and the strip of my mother's dress still wrapped around her knee, and she stood up with the specific courage of someone who is very frightened and has decided to be frightened and speak anyway, which is the only kind of courage that is real. She spoke for 11 minutes. Her voice shook for the first 3, and then steadied. She described 2 years of kitchen work, starting when she was 5, beginning before dawn and ending after dark. No days of rest, no recognition. The matter-of-fact cruelty of a system that had decided her category of existence did not require consideration. She described being cold, and being tired, and being invisible, not in the way of someone asking for pity, but in the way of someone who has decided that the truth deserves to be said out loud, regardless of what it costs. When she finished, she sat back down and looked at her hands. I stood up and walked to where she was sitting and sat down beside her. Not in front of her, not above her. Beside her, on the cold stone floor, so that we were the same height. I did not speak for a moment. I just sat with her in the silence of what she had said, honoring it by not immediately covering it with words. "You were heard," I told her. "What you described will not continue." She nodded once, seriously, in the way of a child who has decided to believe something because the alternative is too heavy to keep carrying. Karan was watching from the edge of the hall. I did not look at him directly, but through the Lunaris awareness, I felt the precise moment when what Pip had described registered in him not as a policy failure, but as a child. A specific child who had been cold and tired and invisible in the pack he was responsible for 2 years before she could read. I felt something crack in him, quietly, in the part of him that his pride did not have jurisdiction over. He sat down on the dais steps, not on the dais, on the steps below it. He folded his long frame onto the stone and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his feet, and he listened for the rest of the night to every wolf who stood and spoke, and he did not interrupt, and he did not correct, and he did not manage. He listened. Over the following 2 days, I listened to more wolves than I can fully account for. Kitchen workers who had not had a day of rest in years. Nursery attendants who had been penalized for the sounds that children make when they are children. Wolves who had been directed into military training when what they wanted was to be healers or teachers or artists, whose actual gifts had been decided irrelevant because the pack needed what the pack hierarchy said it needed, rather than what the individuals inside it were built for. Fated pairs who had been separated because an elder had disapproved of the pairing on political or bloodline grounds, who had been living with the specific and particular damage of a bond that exists and is not allowed to be what it is. Mid-ranked wolves who had watched less talented but better connected packmates advance past them for years, who had swallowed the bitterness of it because the alternative was to challenge a system that had all of the power. And then, on the 4th night, a young warrior, the son of a council member, tall, decorated, by every visible measure an example of what Blackridge valued most. He sat down across from me in the emptying hall after most of the other wolves had gone, and he put his face in his hands, and the sound he made was the sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time, in a place where it was not safe to put it down. He described panic, the physical kind, the kind that arrives without warning and makes the body believe it is dying, that had been happening to him for 3 years, and that he had hidden with the desperate and exhausting ingenuity of a man who understood that being known to experience this thing in Blackridge's current culture would have destroyed his family's standing. That showing weakness was not permitted for men of his bloodline, that he had considered, on 2 separate occasions, what would happen if he simply stopped existing, because the performance of being what the pack required was more than he could sustain indefinitely. I sat with him for a very long time. When he finally went quiet, I said, "A pack that punishes its people for being human is a pack that is slowly eating itself. That ends now." He did not say anything, but when he stood up to leave, he stood differently. Something in his shoulders that had been braced against itself finally given permission to ease. On the morning of the 4th day, I woke knowing something was wrong. Not wrong in the immediate and visceral sense of a threat. Wrong in the quiet, insistent way of something that has been deteriorating for several days and has reached a point where it can no longer be ignored. I lay still for a moment on the sleeping mat in the small room I had been given in the upper quarters and paid attention to the Lunaris awareness, that slow radiating sense of the pack that had been building since I walked back into the hall 3 nights ago. The way you learn the layout of a new house, one room at a time. There was a point of pain, dull and continuous and located with a specificity I could not initially explain. Not a room or a corridor, but a person. Someone in the pack who was in distress that was physical rather than emotional. I followed it through the building awareness the way you follow a sound in darkness, orienting and reorienting until I understood what I was finding. Karan. I found him in the training yard. Dawn had barely arrived. The sky above the mountain, a deep blue-gray, with a single pale stripe of gold along the eastern ridge. The cold so sharp it gave the air an almost crystalline quality. The training yard was empty at this hour except for him. He was moving through a series of combat forms with the focused repetition of someone who is using the body to outrun the mind, the motions still powerful, but carrying something they had not carried before. Raggedness. A slight drag at the end of each movement, a barely perceptible loss of precision, the kind of thing you would not notice if you did not know what you were looking for. I also noticed, closer up, what the distance had obscured. The color gone from his face, or rather, replaced by something wrong. A gray undertone to his skin that had not been there 4 days ago. The dark circles beneath his eyes. The hollows in his cheeks that had not been hollows 3 nights ago. His hands, when he raised them to a guard position, were not quite steady. He had not slept. Not properly. I understood this without asking because the bond sickness did not only take sleep. It took the restorative quality of sleep, leaving you with something that looked like rest from the outside and felt like drowning from the inside. He heard me in the doorway, but did not turn. His jaw set. "I am not here to watch," I said. "You need to stop. I am fine. You are not fine. I can feel it." That made him stop. He lowered the practice sword and turned, slowly, and looked at me across the training yard with an expression that was trying to be closed and was revealing everything. The fear, specifically. He was frightened. He was very good at not looking frightened, and the fear was visible anyway, in the set of his mouth and the quality of his stillness, the specific stillness of someone who is holding themselves together by concentration rather than by having something to hold on to. I walked across the yard and stopped in front of him. Up close, the damage was worse than I had thought from the doorway. He looked in the gray morning light, like a man who had aged a decade in 4 days. Not in the sense of weakness. The bones of him were still imposing, still the architecture of someone who had been built to hold weight. But the light behind his eyes was dimmer. The sharpness was muted. "Bond sickness," I said. "It is accelerating because the fated bond between us was goddess-marked. When you severed it, you did not only damage the bond. You damaged something at the level where the bond was anchored." He looked at me for a moment without speaking. "Can it be repaired?" Not a question that had any vanity in it. Not a question with any defensiveness or deflection. Just a man asking a clean and necessary question about his own survival, which told me more about what these 4 days had cost him than anything he could have said directly. I considered being honest about the uncertainty. I had fragments of the ancestral knowledge, the Lunaris inheritance arriving in pieces rather than whole, triggered by need and circumstance rather than available on demand. The complete picture of what was possible was not yet fully assembled in me. There were things I knew with certainty, and things I was still reaching toward. "The fated mate bond cannot be restored," I said. "That is a certainty. Some breaks are permanent. But there is something else, something older than fated bonds, older than the mate system as the packs understand it. A Lunaris bond. A connection between a moon-blessed wolf and the alpha she chooses to work alongside. He watched me with those storm-gray eyes that the sickness had not yet dimmed entirely. Not ownership, I continued, not romance, not a recreation of what was severed, a partnership, something built to bear weight rather than to burn bright and consume itself. He was quiet for a long moment. "Why would you offer that?" he said. "After what I did to you." I looked at him honestly, because he had asked honestly, and he deserved the same in return. "Because I am not interested in punishment," I said. "I am interested in this pack surviving, and you are the best alpha it has, compromised as you currently are. And because my mother taught me that mercy is not a reward for the deserving, it is a practice, something you do because of what you are, not because of what the other person has earned." Something moved in his face, not quite grief, something in the neighborhood of grief, with a quality of recognition in it, the recognition of someone who has just been shown a version of the world that operates on different principles than the version they have been living in. "I am sorry," he said. The words came out rough, as though they had been a long time in the interior before finding their way out, which I suspected they had. "I know." "No." He shook his head slightly. "I need you to hear it. I am sorry for what I said. For how I said it, for every word of it. You were standing there in your mother's dress, and I looked at you, and I chose the easiest available cruelty, because it was easier than what the alternative would have required from me. I am sorry." I looked at him for a moment, at this man who had called me nothing in front of everyone I had ever known, and who was standing in front of me now in the gray dawn light of a training yard, looking like someone who has been thoroughly and permanently introduced to his own worst self. The man he had been 4 days ago was still visible in him the way the original sketch is still visible under a painting. But something was being painted over it. "I know," I said again. And I meant it differently the second time. I extended my hand. He looked at it. Then he took it. The Lunaris bond formed the way the ley lines had appeared in the clearing, not with a burst of light or a crack of sound, but gradually, deliberately, with the specific, unhurried quality of something that is being built to last rather than to impress. Silver light moved from the point where our hands met, tracing upward along both our wrists, and I felt the connection take shape between us like the first course of stones in a wall, one at a time, each one mortared by something more durable than either of our individual intentions. Through the bond, I felt his wolf. The massive black beast that I had felt an hour ago cowering in the interior of him, pressed flat by the advancing sickness, lifted its head. I felt it in my own chest, the lifting of it, like watching something that has been in darkness finally find a source of light. The sickness began to recede in the way that tide recedes, slowly and with complete inevitability, pulling back from his extremities first, the tremor in his hands easing and then stilling. Color returned to his face, not quickly, but steadily. He looked down at our joined hands, at the matching silver light fading slowly to a warmth rather than a glow, and then he looked up at me. His expression was one I had never seen on his face before. Not dominance, not authority, not the performance of power that I had watched from a distance for years. Something underneath all of those things, something that those things had been built on top of, perhaps, and had eventually obscured. Respect, The uncomplicated, unstrategic respect of a person who has just encountered something that has genuinely surprised them. I let go of his hand. "We have work to do," I said. He nodded once. We went back inside. The 7th day arrived with Vorn Drail. The news came from the western watchtower at first light, a runner arriving in the corridor outside the great hall where I was meeting with the Elder Council. Flushed and breathing hard, Alpha Vorn Drail of Iron Maw was at the outer boundary with 200 warriors requesting entry. Requesting. The word was diplomatic. The reality, as described by the runner, was 200 of the most decorated fighters in the Eastern Territories arranged in combat formation on Black Ridge's approach road, with Vorn Drail on horseback at their head and the specific expression on his face of a man who is phrasing a demand as a request because politeness costs nothing while he still holds the advantage. Karan and I walked to the outer gates together. Behind us, Brecken and a contingent of Black Ridge's best warriors fell into position, not because I asked them to, but because they did, automatically, the way a body moves to protect something it values. Vorn Drail was everything the stories described, and several things they had not adequately conveyed. He was large, not as large as Karan, but carrying a density of presence that came from decades of being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. The specific gravity of a man who has won every confrontation he has ever been in, and has had the time to become very comfortable with that fact. His hair was iron gray, and his eyes were the dark amber of old amber, brown rather than gold. And they found me immediately when the gates opened, passing over Corin as if he were part of the architecture. He smiled, not with warmth. "I have come for the Lunaris," he said, in the tone of a man placing an order at a table where he has always been served whatever he asked for. "Name your price." Black Ridge names what it wants. Territory, resources, an alliance that would make this pack untouchable by any force in the northern or eastern territories. Whatever the price is, Iron Maw pays it, and the Lunaris comes with me. I let him finish. Then I looked at him with the Lunaris awareness fully extended, feeling outward through it, the way you extend a hand in darkness to find the shape of what is there. What I found made me still for a moment. Vorn Drail was afraid, not of me, not yet, but in the way that very powerful people are afraid, not of any specific and present threat, but of the slow, inevitable erosion of the thing they have built their entire identity around. Iron Maw was 3,000 wolves, and it was held together by fear the way a dam is held together by the pressure behind it, each element maintaining its position because the pressure from every other element left it no choice. Not loyalty, not love, not the organic cohesion of a pack that has chosen its direction together. Pressure and the absence of options. He was here because a Lunaris could change that, not by inspiring genuine loyalty. That was not what he was imagining. By amplifying his dominance to a level that made resistance neurologically impossible. By healing the bond damage that his methods had caused. Damage that was accumulating quietly in his pack's infrastructure the way water damage accumulates in a wall, invisible until the wall comes down. By making him permanent. He wanted a weapon wearing the face of a partner. I looked at him for a long moment before I spoke. "That is not what you came for," I said. "You came because you are running out of time, and you think I am the answer to that." His eyes sharpened. "You do not want a Lunaris," I continued. You want a solution to a problem you have not admitted you have. You have 3,000 wolves and the loyalty of approximately none of them. What you have instead of loyalty is the absence of options and the presence of consequences. And both of those things have an expiration date that is closer than you have allowed yourself to calculate. The smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went very still. Corin spoke before Vorn could respond, and his voice had recovered everything the bond sickness had taken from it. Clean and level, and carrying the full weight of an alpha who has recently had reason to clarify his own values. The Lunaris is a member of this pack and a free wolf, he said. If you have business with her, you address her directly. If you cannot manage that, you leave. Vorn looked at Corin for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation that has not gone the direction he expected. Then he looked back at me, and the pretense of the negotiation fell away entirely. Take her, he said. The shift happened between one breath and the next. 200 wolves moving from human to wolf form in a sound like a sustained crack of bone and muscle, the air filling suddenly with the particular smell of a large-scale transformation. And then the road before Black Ridge was full of wolves the size of draft horses, 200 of them, moving in the organized and terrifyingly coordinated formation of a military unit that has done this many times before. Corin shifted instantly. The massive black wolf erupted from his human form with a sound that shook the gates, and behind us the Black Ridge warriors shifted, pouring through the open gates, badly outnumbered and fighting with the specific, desperate fury of wolves defending their home and their people. I did not shift. I stepped forward, past Corin, past the gates, out onto the open ground between the two forces, into the space where the Iron Maw wolves were covering the distance faster than I had calculated. I raised both hands. What happened then happened the way the ley line revelation in the clearing had happened, gradually and then all at once. The moonlight arrived first in my hands, and this time I understood what it was. Not something foreign entering me, but something native to me moving outward. The same force that had pulsed through the ley lines and blazed in the sigil and rung through the Thornwood when I howled. It moved through my palms and hit the ground and spread outward in a wave that was visible as a thin silver line racing across the surface of the road. Every wolf it touched stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped. As if the forward motion had been extracted from them at a cellular level, their legs locking mid-stride, their bodies carrying the momentum of their charge into abrupt stillness in a way that sent several of them tumbling and crashing into each other, the organized military formation dissolving instantly into a tangle of prone wolves, 200 of them, pressed belly down to the road with their ears flat and their tails tucked, and every visible signal of their bodies broadcasting the same involuntary message. I did not tell them to stop. I did not command them. The wave had done something more fundamental than command. It had reached the layer of wolf that exists before commands are relevant. The ancient bedrock animal that knows, without deliberation, what it is in the presence of. And what it was in the presence of was something that its deepest instincts recognized as a level of the hierarchy it had never encountered before. A level above alpha, above beta, above every rank and every structure any of them had ever lived inside. The Lunaris, the original authority, the one written into the wolf's nature before packs had politics. 200 warriors, prone and still and silent in the road before Black Ridge Mountain. I walked through them. I want to be clear about this. I was not performing. I was not making a point. I was simply walking because Vorn Drael was on the far side of his own warriors, and there was something I needed to say to him, and the only way to reach him was through them. They did not move as I passed. Their eyes tracked me, wide and amber and fully wolf, but their bodies remained exactly where the wave had put them. Vorn had remained in human form at the rear of his forces. He was standing very still. The expression on his face had moved through several stages since he had given the order to take me, and the stage it had arrived at was one I recognized because I had worn something like it myself recently in the Great Hall of Blackridge with the rejection bond snapping in my chest. It was the expression of someone encountering the full true shape of something they had fundamentally misunderstood. He was staring at me with eyes that had gone wide, the amber of them visible even at this distance. And what was in them was not calculation anymore. It was fear. The clean, animal, unmanageable kind. The kind that arrives when a predator understands, perhaps for the first time in its life, that there is something on the scale above it. I stopped in front of him. "Here is what is going to happen," I said, and my voice was the layered voice, the voice with the moon behind it, carrying across the road and the prone bodies of his 200 warriors, and up the slope to the gates of Blackridge, where the pack was watching from the walls. "You are going to take your wolves, and you are going to return to Iron Maw. You are going to release every wolf in your pack who is being held in a bond they did not choose. You are going to stop using your pack as a personal army, and you are going to lead them, if you are capable of that, which remains to be established." I held his gaze. "And if I hear," I continued, "and I will hear, because the moon hears everything and tells me what I need to know, that you have harmed a single wolf under your authority, I will come to Iron Maw, and I will not be this gentle." Vorn Drael held my gaze for a long moment. Then he looked away, down, to the ground between us, which was still carrying the faintest trace of silver light where the wave had passed. He turned. He did not give an order. He did not speak at all. He simply turned and began walking back down the road, and his 200 warriors, rising slowly from the ground with the dazed and unsteady movements of wolves who have just had their understanding of the world significantly revised, rose and followed him. They went in silence, all of them, all the way down the road and over the ridge and out of sight, in the specific weighted silence of 200 beings who are recalibrating the architecture of what they thought was possible. I stood on the road and watched them go. Behind me, from the walls of Blackridge, I heard the sound of 300 wolves exhaling simultaneously, and then something that was not quite a cheer and not quite a howl, but was somewhere between the two, spontaneous and genuine, the sound of people who have just watched something they will be telling their children about. I turned back toward the gates. Corin was standing just outside them, in human form again, looking at me across the space between us with an expression I did not immediately have a category for. It took me a moment to place it. He had been afraid for me, not strategically, not as a leader calculating the cost of losing a valuable asset. Afraid in the personal, involuntary sense of someone who has discovered without quite meaning to that another person's safety has become important to them. He did not say anything when I reached him. He did not need to. We walked back through the gates together, and the pack on the walls above us was still making that sound, half cheer and half howl, carrying across the cold mountain air and out over the Thornwood and up into the sky where the morning was finally, fully arriving. Inside the hall, Orrin Croft was waiting. He had watched from the inner courtyard. He was standing near the corridor entrance, not attempting to position himself in the main space, with a deliberate self-placement of someone who understands that his presence in the center of things is no longer appropriate. When I walked in, he looked at me with the direct and uncomfortable honesty of a man who has spent several days sitting with something and has decided to stop sitting with it. "You knew about my mother," I said. It was not a question. It had not been a question the night I said it in the Great Hall either. "Yes," he said. "For how long?" He did not look away. "A long time. Since before you were born." I looked at him. "And you chose to protect your family's position," I said, not with heat, with the flat statement of something that is simply true, over the full expression of what my mother was, and over whatever might have been possible if she had not spent her life hiding. "Yes. Is there more?" "Information you have that I do not." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of that quiet, I found the answer before he gave it. "Your mother was not the last one," he said. "She told me once, in a conversation that she made me swear never to speak of, that she believed there were others. Scattered. Hidden the way she was hidden. She did not know where. She said the moon would lead them to each other when the time was right." I held that information carefully, the way you hold something that is both heavier and more valuable than you expected. Then Orrin Croft knelt slowly on the stone floor of the corridor, not because I asked him to, because he chose to. The deliberate kneeling of a man who is choosing accountability over the dignity of his position. It was, I thought, the beginning of something, not forgiveness, which was not mine alone to offer, but the beginning of the long work of making things right, which starts with the person doing the reckoning actually beginning it. I left him there and walked back toward the great hall, where the evening session would begin in an hour, and the wolves of Blackridge would sit on the floor together in the torchlight and continue the work of learning what they actually were when the hierarchy was not telling them. Outside, through the high windows of the corridor, I could hear the pack on the walls still making that sound. And somewhere in the distance, moving away down the road toward the Eastern Territories, 200 wolves were carrying a message that would reach every pack on the continent before the moon was full again. The Lunaris had returned, and the world was going to have to decide what to do with that. 6 months is not a long time. In the span of a pack's history, 400 years of accumulated tradition and hierarchy and the specific calcified habits of a community that has been doing things the same way for so long that the original reasons have been forgotten, and the habits themselves have become the reasons. 6 months is barely a breath. It is not enough time to fix everything. It is not enough time to undo the generations of damage that a broken system inflicts on the people living inside it. Anyone who told you otherwise would be lying. And I had made a commitment to myself in the clearing in the Thornwood that I would not lie to the pack or to myself about what was possible and on what timeline. But 6 months is enough time to begin. And beginning, I had learned, was everything. I stood on the balcony of Blackridge's highest tower in the last light of an autumn evening and watched the mountain below me and let myself feel, without qualification or caveat, what it felt like to look at what had been built in half a year from the wreckage of a single night. The training yard was still lit, even in the failing light. I could see from the balcony, if I leaned slightly against the stone railing, the shapes of wolves moving through forms together, not separated by rank or bloodline as they had been 4 months ago, when the high-ranked warriors had their yard and their hours, and the lower-ranked wolves had the remnants of both. Together, the same yard, the same hours, a decorated senior warrior named Haddon, who had come forward in the 3rd week of the evening sessions to say that he had always wanted to teach rather than fight, now running a class that included 3 former Omegas who were turning out to have natural gifts for combat that the old system had never given them a reason to discover. I watched Haddon correct a young Omega's form with the specific patience of someone who has found the work they were always built for, and I felt the warmth of it through the pack bond, that vast and shimmering web of connection that had been growing steadily for 6 months, becoming more nuanced with each passing week, a living document of the pack's collective interior. From the lower kitchens, 4 floors below, I could smell the evening meal being prepared. Real food, the kind that took time and care, not the minimal subsistence that the lower quarters had been served while the upper tables had abundance. Bet, the kitchen worker who had been the first wolf to sit on the floor with me that initial night, now ran the kitchen rotation with a quiet authority that had surprised everyone except the people who had actually worked beside her for years and known exactly what she was capable of. She had a day off every 7 days. They all did. It seemed like a small thing. I knew it was not. Delara left Blackridge on the 43rd day, not because I asked her to, not because Corin asked her to. She packed what she could carry and walked out through the lower gates before dawn, alone, without ceremony, in the specific and self-imposed exile of someone who can no longer bear to stand inside the evidence of what they chose. I felt her go through the pack bond, that single thread pulling thin and then releasing entirely as she crossed the boundary. She had no pack now, no rank, no Corin, no architecture built on someone else's smallness. Whether she would find something worth building on her own terms was a question only she could answer. The honest truth was that I hoped she would, not for my sake, for hers, because a person who has only ever been defined by what they stood next to deserves at least the chance to find out what they are when they stand alone. Orin remained. He had stepped down as Beta the morning after Vorndrail left, appearing at the Great Hall before dawn with no preamble and no performance, requesting to be reassigned to gate duty, the lowest posted position in the pack. The hall had gone quiet when he said it. I had told him the assignment was his if he wanted it. He had nodded once and left. He showed up at the gate post every morning since, on time, without complaint, in the deliberate and unglamorous penance of a man who has chosen to make something right rather than merely to say that he will. Pip found me on the balcony, which was not unusual. She had developed the habit of appearing wherever I happened to be, not following me exactly, more as if she had an instinct for where the center of things was and gravitated toward it naturally. She was 8 now, or nearly 8. And the dark, serious eyes had not changed, but the way she moved through the mountain had. Less careful, less practiced at being invisible. She did not speak when she arrived. She leaned against the railing beside me and looked out at the mountain in the evening light with the companionable silence of someone who has learned that not all presence requires explanation. After a while, she said, "Haddon says I have good instincts." "You do," I said. She considered this. "For combat or for other things?" "Both," I said. Probably for most things, if you are given the space to find out. She nodded, satisfied, in the way of a child who was asked a question that actually needed asking and received an answer that actually addressed it. Then she went back inside, leaving me with the evening and the view and the slow accumulation of a feeling I was still learning to name. I heard Corin before I saw him. That was the Lunaris bond, the quiet, reliable hum of it that had been part of my interior landscape for nearly 6 months now. The sense of another consciousness moving through the world at a specific and knowable distance. Not intrusive, not consuming. More like knowing, without looking up, that someone you trust has entered the room. He stepped onto the balcony and leaned against the railing an arm's length from me and looked out at the mountain. He was wearing no rank markers, which he had stopped doing within the first month, some deliberate laying down of the performance of authority that he had described to me once, briefly and without much elaboration, as feeling like putting down something he had not realized was heavy until he set it down. He looked different than he had 7 months ago, not softer. Corin Ashvale was never going to be a soft person, and that was not what I would have wanted from him, even if it had been possible. But the specific quality of his presence had changed, the way a room changes when the furniture is rearranged not to impress visitors, but to actually accommodate the people living there. Something in him had been rearranged toward function rather than impression. He was still learning, still failing sometimes, still catching himself mid-pattern and adjusting course without drama. That, I had come to understand, was the actual work of becoming. Not a single transformation in a torchlit hall. 1,000 small corrections, made daily, without an audience. Vorn is moving toward the Greymane territory, he said. I know. I felt it through the ley lines this morning. Karan was quiet for a moment. Should we? I will contact Greymane tonight, I said. Their alpha is reasonable, and I will send Vorn a reminder. He looked at me sideways. A reminder. A dream, I said. The Lunaris can move through moonlight into sleep when it is necessary. I will make sure he remembers clearly what happens if he begins a war. Something moved at the corner of Karan's mouth, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. I have been thinking, he said, and then stopped. This was a newer habit in him, starting sentences and stopping them. Not from evasion, but from the unfamiliar experience of thinking carefully before speaking, of not simply deploying words as instruments of authority. I had learned to wait rather than fill the gaps. I was thinking about what you said once, he continued, about your mother, that she chose to protect you over the full expression of what she was, and that she was right to protect you but wrong about the protection requiring you to be hidden. I looked at him. I made the same choice, he said, in the hall that night. I chose what was easy and familiar over what was true, and I told myself it was a reasonable decision made for reasonable reasons, and it was not. It was fear dressed up as strategy. I know, I said. I know you know. He turned to look at me directly, and the gray of his eyes in the fading light was the color of the sky above the Thornwood at dusk, complicated and layered and carrying more weather than it appeared to on first glance. I am telling you anyway, because you deserve to have it said plainly, and I was not capable of that 7 months ago. I held his gaze. The Lunaris bond hummed quietly between us, that steady and foundational warmth, the thing that was not a fated bond, and not a romance, and was still, undeniably, something. Something that had been growing steadily for 6 months in the way that things grow when they are given proper conditions. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the deep and unhurried certainty of roots finding water. "Do you think," he said, and stopped again. "Ask," I said. He was quiet for another moment. "Do you think there is something after this?" he said. "After the work and the changes and the building of whatever this becomes, something that is not a bond the goddess wrote and not a partnership of necessity, but something we—" He stopped himself again, and this time I thought it was not because he did not know how to finish, but because he was not sure he had the right to finish. I looked out at the mountain. The last light was going, the sky deepening to the particular dark blue that precedes the appearance of stars, and below us the sounds of Black Ridge were the sounds of a community settling into its evening, not the tense and careful quiet of a hierarchy maintaining itself through pressure, but the genuine and varied sounds of 300 individuals living alongside each other in a space that was, slowly and incrementally, becoming safe enough for them to actually be themselves. "Ask me again in a year," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, low and genuine, the sound of a man who has found something unexpectedly hopeful in an answer that might look from the outside like a deflection. It was not a deflection. He knew that. I felt it in the bond, the understanding of it, the warmth of a door that is not open yet, but is demonstrably not locked. "A year," he said. "A year," I confirmed. We stood together in the dark for a while longer, not speaking, not needing to, watching the stars arrive one by one above the Thornwood until the sky was full of them. From the valley below, a howl rose, single and clear and unhurried, carrying in the cold air with the particular quality of something genuine, not the ceremonial howl of a pack performing its cohesion, but the real and spontaneous sound of a wolf who is simply, presently, without qualification, glad to be alive. Another joined it, then 3 more, then a dozen, then dozens, until the valley was full of it, the sound building and lifting and traveling outward across the mountain and into the forest and up into the sky, a chorus without conductor, without hierarchy, 300 voices each contributing their specific and unrepeatable note to something that was larger than any of them individually and belonged to all of them equally. I tilted my head back and closed my eyes, and I added my voice to it. Not the Lunaris howl, not the moon-splitting sound that had shaken the Thornwood and brought 200 warriors to their knees. Just my voice, Vessa Thorn's voice, the voice of a girl who had grown up small and overlooked in the lower quarters of a mountain, and had been told she was nothing by the person the moon had chosen as the instrument of her becoming. My voice, joining the others, belonging to them, one of them, also more than that, but first and most fundamentally one of them. Somewhere above us, in the silver and endless silence of the sky, the moon hung full and white and warm, and I felt it the way I had felt the earth in the clearing, the way I had felt my mother's hand, the vast and ancient and deeply personal attention of something that had been watching over this moment for 300 years. And somewhere in the silver light between the moon and the mountain, in the space where the howls rose and dissolved into the night, I felt the warmth of something I had not expected to find at the end of the worst night of my life. Not power, not vindication, not even the satisfaction of having been right, though I had been right. Peace. The simple, earned, unassailable peace of someone who has crossed a great distance and arrived at the place they were always traveling toward, and sat down in it and found it exactly large enough for everything they were. The next morning arrived as mornings do, without ceremony, the pale gold of early light finding its way through the stone windows of the upper quarters and landing on the floor in long, quiet rectangles. I was already awake. I had been awake for an hour, sitting at the window of my room with a cup of tea going cold in my hands and the ley lines faintly visible in my peripheral awareness the way they always were now, silver and constant and immeasurably old. The veins of the world going about their work. I felt the messenger before I heard him. A new presence at the outer boundary, unfamiliar, moving through the approach road with a steadiness that was neither hurried nor hesitant. Not a threat. Something else. Something that pulsed in the Lunaris awareness with a frequency I recognized but could not immediately place, like hearing a voice you know in a crowd and not yet being able to identify it. The runner came to my door 20 minutes later. "A man at the outer gates," she said. "No pack markings, no colors. He says he carries a message but would only deliver it to you directly." I set down the cold tea and stood. The messenger was waiting in the outer courtyard, standing quietly in the morning light with the patient stillness of someone who has been traveling for a long time and has learned not to spend energy on restlessness. He was unremarkable in appearance, medium height, traveling clothes in undyed gray, no insignia of any kind. His hands were at his sides. When I stepped through the courtyard gate, he turned, and I saw his face. And I also saw, when the sleeve of his traveling coat fell back as he turned, the mark on the inside of his left wrist. Not identical to mine. Similar in the way that two trees grown from seeds of the same tree are similar, recognizably related, carrying the same essential structure expressed in a slightly different form. A full moon, and within it something different from my silver stag, something I needed another moment to resolve. A wolf, mid-leap, caught in moonlight. He looked at the mark on my wrist and then up at my face, and in his eyes was the expression I had worn in the Thornwood clearing, the expression of someone encountering recognition so profound it bypasses the ordinary channels of response and arrives in the body before the mind has caught up. He knelt, not with the involuntary submission of a wolf responding to dominance, deliberately, with the formal and intentional reverence of a greeting between people who share a lineage that neither of them, until recently, knew they were part of. "I have been looking for you," he said, "for a long time." I looked at him, at the mark on his wrist, at the evidence, living and present and kneeling on the courtyard stones, that my mother had been right in the one thing she had told Orrin Croft in confidence all those years ago. There were others. I reached down and extended my hand. "Stand up," I said, "and tell me everything." Behind me, I heard the soft sound of Karan arriving in the courtyard, having felt through the bond the precise quality of my attention shift. I felt him take in the scene, the stranger, the mark, my extended hand, and I felt the bond carry his response to me without words. Steady, present. Whatever this is, I am here. The messenger took my hand and stood, and the next chapter of everything began.